Students, to support tutorial number 4, we're going to investigate changes in market equilibrium. That's what you learned in tutorial 3, was about market equilibrium. Now we're going to say what if, and then we're going to have a look at government intervention. What happens if government interferes with the operation of these market forces? Your focus in this tutorial is on Learning Unit 4. That's what you'll be covering in class, or should have covered in class by now. We're going to take a look at how different variables affect the market equilibrium. Do they affect demand? Do they affect supply? What happens if they affect both? Simultaneous change, a change in both demand and supply at the same time. We're then going to take a look at how and why government might intervene in a market. And then we're going to have a quick look or a quick analysis of what the consequences of that intervention are likely to be. At the end of tutorial 3, we introduced you to market equilibrium. This is how prices are established in a market, in a perfectly competitive market. And market equilibrium occurs when the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied at the specific price that is determined in that market. Remember how to describe or tell the story as to how this happens. Really, really important, because that's going to help you to understand going forward. When you are looking at changes, there are two ways that you are going to have to deal with this in the main. It's going to either be a theoretical question, could be a multiple choice or explain, or it's going to be draw the graph. In many, many instances, they're going to require you to draw a graph to illustrate some sort of change in the market equilibrium. Your starting position, ladies and gents, must always be this simple equilibrium graph. Please make sure that you label your axes, you label your curves, and you label your equilibrium positions accurately before you start. Don't try to answer the question until you've got your basic equilibrium position fully labeled and drawn in front of you. So here we have it. Now we can go in and say, all right, so what if they're asking us here to go in and show that only demand increases? Now you apply your rules. The rules tell us that an increase in demand will shift the demand curve to the right. So there I go, and I put in my new demand curve. So there's my new demand curve shifting to the right, and I go in and I call this D1. And then I go in and I say, all right, where's my new equilibrium position? There it is. So I mark my new equilibrium position, call that E1. And then what I do is I mark in my price. So now I'm going to read what is the equilibrium price and what is the equilibrium quantity when I have this increase in demand. All right, so let's go on to the next slide, which is completed, and then we can describe in a little bit more detail what you should be able to illustrate and explain. So here we see it. We've got our demand curve has shifted to the right from D to D1. We've got our new equilibrium position. We can see that our equilibrium price has increased and our equilibrium quantity has also increased. The question now is, what has happened to supply? Well, you must recognize from this that supply has stayed the same. Ceteris paribus supply, it has remained the same. It has not changed at all. But what has happened to quantity supplied? There's been a movement along that supply curve, and that we would say is an increase in quantity supplied. The next thing that you have to be able to do is deal with what could have caused this to happen. Now, let's assume that that increase in demand was for Coca-Cola, for example. So what are the determinants or the variables or the changes in the variables that could have caused the demand for Coca-Cola to increase? So, for example, if a substitute is Pepsi, what must have happened to the price of Pepsi? The price of Pepsi must have increased. We don't want Pepsi, we want Coca-Cola. Then we can go and have a look and say, what must have happened to the price of a complement? For example, maybe we want peanuts or crisps with our Coca-Cola. The price of a complement must have decreased. The next two are relatively easy. Consumer income must have increased. The demand for any normal product will increase when a consumer's income increases, and preferences or a desire for that product must be greater, or also we could say has increased. Expected future price, a little bit challenging. So what must we expect the price of Coca-Cola to do in the future if we want to demand more now, or if we are demanding more now? We must be expecting that price to increase. Test yourself with these, ladies and gents. You've got two options. You can try and understand it like I'm doing with you here, or you can go to the textbook. The tables do give you a full description on all of this that I've done with you here, and that might help you to understand it as well. Next, we look at an increase in supply. Once again, your rules are the same. You would start with your basic equilibrium position, and then you would say, what if? What if supply increases? It will be a shift to the right. And there we see our supply curve has shifted to the right. We've got our new equilibrium position. There's our new equilibrium price, which we can see has now decreased, and our new equilibrium quantity, which we can see has increased. Once again, we ask questions that are a little bit more complex. What happens to demand? Demand remains the same because demand has not changed. And then what happens to quantity demanded? The quantity demanded has moved along. You can see there's a movement along our demand curve, which means quantity demanded has increased. What could have caused this increase in supply? Well, here this time I haven't done it in a test format. I've just given you the information. Just remember you're dealing now with a producer or a supplier, and they always want the highest possible price. So for example, if that was the supply of maize meal, what must have happened to the price of a substitute of maize meal for us to want to supply more maize meal? The price of the substitute would have decreased, because the supplier wants to supply the product that he or she can get the highest possible price. Make sure you go through each of these, ladies and gents, and be sure that you understand the why. It must make sense to you, because if it doesn't, you will find that you haven't understood it, or you won't remember it, or you're going to struggle because you've made an error. If it makes sense, it means you've probably got it correct and you'll remember it correctly. Take note of this one. You should work through the textbook and check what happens when demand decreases and then when supply decreases, so that you can work with both your increase and your decrease in demand and supply. We're going to do application quickly just to see. We're going to force you now to work with decrease. Perhaps you've already looked at it. If you haven't, maybe you can just work out, based on what I've learned about an increase in demand and an increase in supply, am I able to work with decreases as well? The trick now is also to remember that you've got to identify the variable. So in this case, I've said assume that the preference for this product in this market preferences decrease. Explain the impact on equilibrium price and quantity. Now, when you look at this, you've got to identify that preferences for this product is a determinant of demand and not supply. Therefore, it's going to impact on your demand curve. Next thing we have to do is decide increase or decrease in demand. Well, you should be able to understand that if we don't want this product anymore, there's going to be a decrease in demand, and therefore we are going to shift the demand curve to the left. So there we see our demand curve goes to the left, and what we do is we go in quickly and we do what I've already taught you. We go in, we mark our new equilibrium position, we go in and check what is our equilibrium price, what is our equilibrium quantity, and then we can read our graph. Once you've done that, the next step of actually giving me the information, in other words, what has happened to equilibrium quantity and what has happened to equilibrium price, should be fairly easy because you're just reading it straight off your graph. All right, so fairly straightforward there if you know and have learned your rules. Application 2, we've said here, assume that the cost of inputs, so in this case we've said the cost of inputs increase. This is going to be a factor that does not affect demand, it will affect supply, and it's going to cause a decrease in supply, so therefore my supply curve is going to shift to the left. So once again, in each case it was a decrease, and it's a leftward shift. So there we go. We now want to go and mark it. Always remember to mark your information. And then our new equilibrium, let's put equilibrium this side so that we can not interfere with our dotted lines for our price. What has happened to my equilibrium price? what has happened to my equilibrium quantity. And then, folks, once I said, as I said to you before, fairly easy to go in and read what is actually happening on your graph. Sorry about the writing. Using the mouse can be a little bit of a challenge. And there's our Q1. So there we have it, folks. You can see easily how to do this. Make sure you can work with both an increase and a decrease. Now I want to check that you can read a graph. So for example, if you were given something like this, now with numbers in, notice we were working conceptually before without our numbers. Now we just want to check, are you able to read your actual graph? Let me grab my laser. There we go. So first question, what is the quantity supplied when the price is 10 Rand? All right, so let's go into 10 Rand. We go across, all the way to your supply curve, and then you drop it down. The quantity supplied at a price of 10 Rand is 90 units. All right, very straightforward, but you've got to read carefully and accurately. Next question, what is the quantity demanded on D1 when the price is 4 Rand? So we've got 4. Now we must watch out because we've got 2 demand curves. All right, so we go all the way along 4. We can't stop at that first one because that's not the correct one. So we go all the way and we drop it down, and there we see it's 100 units. Fairly straightforward if you know what you're doing. Then question 3, what is the equilibrium price and quantity for DO and S? We go to DO and S, and we can see 6. There's where the intersection is. 6 Rand is my equilibrium price, and 70 units is my equilibrium quantity. So ladies and gents, obviously there can be more complex questions that we can ask on this, but I just wanted you to make sure that you're able to at least read a graph, or if you are aware that you struggle, then make sure that you make a plan so that you can get to read those graphs accurately. All right, this is the end of part 1. So we are done with that. I'll see you shortly in part 2.